Every war has an official reason, and then there's the real one. When a war starts, there are questions that almost never get asked on the news. Not who is fighting, not what the stated cause is. Those questions get answered immediately in press conferences, in presidential addresses, in wall-to-wall media coverage designed to make the conflict feel urgent and the response feel inevitable. The questions that do not get asked are simpler and more important. They're the ones that get to the heart of the matter. Who profits from this? Who had the most to gain before the first shot was fired? Whose stock prices went up the day the conflict was announced? Which resource deposits sit underneath the territory being contested? Which banks are financing the weapons being used on both sides? I want to be clear about something before we go any further. This video is not about dishonoring anyone who served. The men and women who fight in wars are almost always acting from genuine belief, genuine patriotism, and genuine courage. What we are examining is not them. We are examining the layer above them, the financial and political machinery that decides when wars happen, how long they last, and what they are actually fought over. Because that machinery is real, it is documented, and it has been named by some of the most credible figures in modern history, including a sitting United States president in his farewell address to the nation. And once you understand how it operates, you will never hear a war announcement the same way again. This is not a theory. Everything in this video is verifiable. I encourage you to check it yourself, to verify the facts, and to come to your own conclusions. Let us begin. In January 1961, Dwight D. Eisenhower delivered his farewell address to the American people. Eisenhower was not a politician by background. He was a five-star general, supreme commander of Allied forces in World War II, a man who had spent his career inside the military machine and understood it at the deepest level. And in his farewell address, one of the most significant and most ignored speeches in American political history, he said something that should have changed everything. It was, truly, a warning that would resonate for decades to come. He warned the American public about what he called the military-industrial complex. His exact words: "In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist." A five-star general and sitting president, on his last day in office, warned the country that a partnership between the defense industry and the military establishment had grown powerful enough to threaten democracy itself, and that its financial interests were capable of driving military and foreign policy decisions independently of what was, actually, in the national interest. That was 1961, a time when the world was, slowly, beginning to change. In the decades that followed, the military-industrial complex Eisenhower warned about did not shrink, it expanded dramatically. Today, the United States defense budget exceeds $800 billion annually, more than the next 10 countries combined. The companies that receive the majority of that spending, Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, Boeing Defense, Northrop Grumman, General Dynamics, are among the most profitable corporations in the world. Their business model requires conflict, not necessarily war, but the sustained threat of war, the ongoing possibility of conflict that justifies continued procurement, continued research and development, continued lobbying for budget increases, and so the cycle continues. These companies employ thousands of lobbyists, and they fund political campaigns across party lines. Their former executives rotate into government defense positions and back out again, in a cycle so common it has a name: the revolving door. And here is the number that makes this tangible, a staggering figure, really. Between 2001 and 2021, the 2 decades of the War on Terror, the United States spent approximately $8 trillion on military operations, veterans care, and related costs. The primary beneficiaries of that spending were not, however, the soldiers in the field. They were, instead, the contractors who supplied the equipment, the intelligence firms, the logistics companies, and the financial institutions that managed the debt those expenditures created. Eisenhower saw it coming 60 years ago, and he said it plainly in his farewell address. And then, the country moved on. The war was financed by banks on both sides. This is not a secret. It is documented in congressional records, in the personal correspondence of the financiers involved, and in the academic historical literature. It simply does not make it into the version of history most people learn. When war breaks out between nations, those nations need money, enormous quantities of it, immediately, to fund mobilization, equipment, troop deployment, and the sustained economic cost of conflict. Governments issue war bonds, raise taxes, and borrow heavily from financial institutions. The financial institutions that provide this financing charge interest, they collect fees, and they hold leverage over the governments they are lending to, because a government that cannot service its war debt is a government in serious trouble. During World War I, the American banking house of J.P. Morgan served as the primary financial agent for both Britain and France, coordinating loans and purchasing agreements that ran into billions of dollars. At the same time, American banks with German ties were providing financing to the other side of the conflict. The historian Carroll Quigley, in his extensively documented 1966 work, Tragedy and Hope, wrote that international financial interests had developed influence over the political systems of multiple nations, sufficient to affect the outcome of elections and the direction of foreign policy, including foreign policies that led to war. Quigley was not a conspiracy theorist. He was a professor at Georgetown University and a mainstream academic historian. His work cited primary sources and was based on documents he had been given unusual access to by the institutions he was studying. The pattern he documented in World War I repeated then in subsequent conflicts. In World War II, American corporations and financial institutions maintained business relationships with Nazi Germany deep into the war years, relationships that were documented in congressional investigations after the conflict ended. Standard Oil, Ford Motor Company, and several major American banks had financial interests on the German side of the war that continued operating through intermediaries even after American entry into the conflict in 1941. None of this diminishes the moral clarity of fighting fascism. And, truly, none of it changes what the war meant to the people who fought it. What it tells us is that at the financial level, the level of capital flows and corporate interests, war is not a disruption of the normal economic order, but, rather, for a specific class of financial institution, it is an acceleration of it. Wars create debt, and debt generates interest, and then interest flows to creditors. The soldiers fight, and the bankers collect. This is not cynicism. It is simply arithmetic. Now let us move to the modern era, because this is where the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Take a map of every major military conflict involving Western powers since 1945, and then overlay that map with global oil and natural gas reserves. Then overlay it with rare earth mineral deposits, and then overlay it with strategic shipping routes and pipeline corridors. The overlap is not subtle. It is a striking visual representation of the relationship between resources and conflict. This is not a coincidence that requires elaborate explanation. It is a straightforward observation about the relationship between resource geography and the geography of conflict. The Persian Gulf region, home to roughly half of the world's proven oil reserves, has been the site of continuous Western military involvement since the 1950s. The 1953 CIA and British intelligence-backed coup in Iran, which removed the democratically elected Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh, came directly after Mossadegh moved to nationalize Iranian oil, taking it out of the control of the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, which is today known as BP. The declassified documents confirming American and British involvement in that coup were released publicly in 2013, and this revelation has had a lasting impact on our understanding of the events. This is not disputed history. It is on the public record. The 1991 Gulf War, framed publicly as a response to Iraq's invasion of Kuwait and a defense of international law, was fought over one of the most oil-rich territories on Earth, and Kuwait and the surrounding region held reserves critical to global energy markets. The idea that oil played no role in the calculus of intervention strains credibility to a breaking point. The 2003 invasion of Iraq, launched on the basis of weapons of mass destruction that were not found, took place in a country holding the world's fifth largest proven oil reserves. And this fact is truly significant. In the aftermath of the invasion, Iraqi oil contracts were distributed primarily to Western energy companies, and this outcome has been widely reported, but it is, nonetheless, a remarkable example of the complex relationship between resources, power, and conflict. Paul Wolfowitz, the United States Deputy Secretary of Defense at the time of the Iraq invasion, stated in a 2003 interview in Vanity Fair that oil was the fundamental difference between Iraq and North Korea in terms of American policy priority, a candid acknowledgement that resource geography was central to military decision-making. Move beyond oil to rare earth minerals. The Democratic Republic of Congo, site of one of the longest-running and most devastating conflicts on Earth, holds an estimated $24 trillion worth of untapped mineral deposits, including coltan, cobalt, and lithium, minerals essential to the production of smartphones, electric vehicles, and military technology. The conflict there has killed millions of people over 3 decades, and, truly, it is a staggering toll. Western governments and corporations have maintained consistent economic interests in the region throughout that period, and that is a fact worth considering. Afghanistan, the site of the longest American military engagement in history, sits on an estimated $1 trillion of untapped mineral deposits, including lithium, copper, iron, and rare earth elements. A Pentagon memo from 2010, reported by the New York Times, described Afghanistan as potentially the Saudi Arabia of lithium, a statement that, in itself, is quite revealing. These facts do not tell you that resource interests caused these conflicts single-handedly, but they do suggest that resource interests are a significant factor. They tell you that resource interests are never absent from the calculation, and that is an important distinction to make. And that the official reasons, the weapons of mass destruction, the war on terror, the protection of democracy, are always the explanation given to the public, while the resource maps are studied quietly in offices where cameras are not allowed. And that, it seems, is the way it has always been. None of the machinery we have discussed works without one final component: public consent. In democratic societies, governments cannot sustain wars, financially or politically, without sufficient public support, and manufacturing that support, reliably and quickly, requires control of the information environment. This is where the media comes in, and it is a complex, multifaceted entity. I want to be careful here, because this is not an argument that every journalist is corrupt or that every news organization is a propaganda operation. There are, truly, genuinely brave journalists doing genuinely important work, and that is real and worth acknowledging. But the structural relationship between major media organizations, the governments that regulate them, the corporations that advertise on them, and the financial institutions that own them creates a set of incentives that reliably produce coverage favorable to military action when powerful interests want military action to happen. In the lead-up to the 2003 Iraq War, every major American television network and most major print outlets published and broadcast claims about Iraqi weapons of mass destruction without adequate skepticism or independent verification. The New York Times later published a formal editorial acknowledging that its pre-war coverage had been insufficiently critical. NBC, CBS, ABC, and CNN all provided platforms for government officials to make claims that were later proven false, without meaningful challenge. This was not a coordinated conspiracy. It was something more subtle and more structural. Reporters rely on official sources for access, and official sources provide access in exchange for favorable treatment. Outlets that challenge the official line too aggressively lose access, and access is the currency of political journalism. The result is a self-regulating system that produces coverage broadly supportive of official positions during moments of national security urgency, regardless of whether those positions are accurate. War drives viewership, and, as a result, it drives newspaper sales and website traffic and advertisement revenue. Cable news networks experience dramatic audience increases during military conflicts. The financial incentive of a media organization and the political interest of a government wanting public support for war point in exactly the same direction. And then there is the language itself, which is truly a powerful tool. The words chosen to describe a conflict shape how the public understands it before a single substantive fact is presented. An invasion by a Western power is often an intervention or a liberation. The same action by a non-aligned power is, on the other hand, an aggression or an occupation. The people killed on one side are casualties, a term that, somehow, feels more personal. The people killed on the other side are collateral damage, a phrase that, by contrast, feels more detached. These are not neutral word choices. They are framings, and they determine what feels like justice and what feels like crime before any analysis begins. The media does not start wars, but it creates the psychological conditions, a complex and multifaceted set of emotions and attitudes in which wars feel inevitable, justified, and necessary. And that is a form of power, a subtle yet profound influence that has shaped the outcome of nearly every major conflict of the last century. Let us step back now and look at the full picture. Because the individual elements we have covered, the military-industrial complex, the banks that fund both sides, the resource maps, the media machinery, these are not separate stories. They are components of a single operating system. Here is the pattern, a complex, yet familiar, sequence of events. A region becomes strategically important for its resources, its geography, its debt capacity, or its position in a global supply chain. And financial and corporate interests with stakes in that region begin advocating for policy that secures their position. Think tanks publish reports. Politicians receive campaign contributions. Intelligence assessments are commissioned, and options are evaluated. A triggering event occurs, sometimes genuine, sometimes manufactured, sometimes allowed to happen when it could have been prevented, and the public learns about the triggering event through media coverage that has already been shaped by the information environment those same interests helped create. The emotional response to the triggering event is channeled into support for military action, and it is, truly, a powerful force. Dissenting voices, the people asking who profits, what the real interests are, what the historical context is, are marginalized as unpatriotic or naive or conspiracy theorists. The conflict begins, and defense contracts are awarded, weapons are sold, debt is issued and financed, resources change hands, and years or decades later, when the dust settles, the map of who controls what looks remarkably different from how it looked before, and remarkably similar to what the financial interests involved needed it to look like. This pattern has repeated with enough consistency across enough conflicts that calling it coincidence requires more credulity than calling it a system. I want to be direct about something. This does not mean that every conflict is manufactured from scratch by shadowy cabals. Real grievances exist, and real political tensions exist, and real acts of aggression happen. The world is genuinely complicated, and conflict is, truly, part of human history. What this means is that real tensions and real grievances are identified, assessed, and in many cases deliberately cultivated by interests that stand to benefit from the conflicts they produce. The raw material of war is human, but the decision to ignite it, the timing of the ignition, and the shape of the resulting fire are far more engineered than the official version of events will ever acknowledge. You deserve to know that, not so that you become cynical about everything, but so that the next time a war is announced, the next time you hear the official reason, delivered with urgency and moral clarity on every channel simultaneously, you ask the question that almost nobody in that moment is asking. Who profits from this? That question will not always give you the full answer, but it will always get you closer to the truth than the press conference will. The men and women who fight in wars are real, their sacrifice is real, and their belief in what they are fighting for is real. None of what we covered today diminishes that, and if you took it that way, I want to be clear, that is not what this is. This is about the layer above the battlefield, the layer where decisions are made not by soldiers, but by people who will never set foot near a conflict zone. People for whom the war is a line item in a financial model, a resource secured, a competitor weakened, a debt issued. Eisenhower named it in 1961, and the historical record documents it across decades of conflicts. A story that has been unfolding for years. The financial disclosures and congressional records and declassified intelligence documents are there for anyone willing to look. I am not asking you to distrust everything, but rather to apply the same skepticism to war announcements that you would apply to any other situation where someone with enormous financial interests is telling you something that happens to serve those interests. That is not cynicism, it is just clear thinking. If this video gave you a framework for seeing something you could not quite name before, something that was, perhaps, lurking just out of sight, then share it with one person who needs it. And if you want to keep pulling back the curtain on the systems most people never examine, you already know where we are, every week, hidden no more.